So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the second tabernacle services, using then the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of Yahweh, indicating us then the understanding of the time of the end. It is studying from Mashiyach, the 61st chapter, where we find then ourselves during the time of restoration in Mashiyach the Levite, 24th chapter, the time of reduction. There is a very interesting study, and it is related with the Mount of Transfiguration. And as we study then the center point of the entire Gospels and also the Galah regarding Revelation, we find ourselves then step by step evaluating the Mashiyach during his time of the 490 days of ministry. Then we find himself walking near the place where then there was a lady over there, and he was asking for water. It was a city of the Samaritans. And then we understand during the time of the Mashiyach, when he was completing the spring feast, many times then the leaders of the law were very angry with the Mashiyach, and there were times he left the city. When we began our quest, then understanding those 2 days given to the Samaritans as then the layer of the Gentiles' rulership of the earth, then we began our quest with Mount Gerizim. As then the Samaritans always were taught they should worship on Mount Gerizim. It's very interesting because there are some contradictions, and these can be clearly evaluated and straightened out. And primarily we begin our study then understanding what was the Mashiyach doing then during the time he spent with the Samaritans. It's very simple. The Gospels, they are not in chronological order, and the focus point of the Gospels then is wrong. They should have taken into consideration the tabernacle services of the Mashiyach. The Mashiyach said to the lady over there while he was asking for water, they should not be either on this mountain or in Jerusalem, but those who would worship Yahweh in his tabernacle. Was speaking of the Mashiyach as the tabernacle. Should worship then Yahweh in the spirit, the link with the Gentiles and the world via his tabernacle, in spirit and in truth. So then we find ourselves then understanding the way then the Mashiyach was invited into the city. Then the Mashiyach was very warmly received, because she received understandings of her life via the Mashiyach, and then she divulged his presence, and the entire city, they were very, very contented with his presence. The Mashiyach goes into the city, and then he began his 2 days of scripture explanation. While the Mashiyach was in the city of Jerusalem, he was not received. When he went to the city of the Samaritans, he was very received. So then, the clue of this point is the conversation with the lady while he was asking for water. She said that her forefathers told her that they should worship on Mount Gerizim. The enlightenment of the first tabernacle service in Jerusalem makes no sense. But it does make sense when you understand the Mashiyach as the second tabernacle services. Then the Mount of Transfiguration was not in Jerusalem. It was in Mount Gerizim. Why? Was because the Mashiyach was proving his point. Not only is not going to be on this mountain in Jerusalem, but then those who worship Yahweh must worship in his tabernacles. So the Mashiyach then he proved his point by having on a Mount Gerizim, then he was transfigured, or then showed up Moshe and Eliyahu the law and the prophets, and then Yohanan, Shimon, and Yaakov were there with him. However, when they came down, they did not divulge what went on. Later we find pieces of it from Luke, then explaining the Messiah went then to the city of the Samaritans, and then they fell to provide for him for his journey to observe the feast in Jerusalem. But the context is then when the Messiah had sent his people. The Messiah was not there in person. He sent some of his people into the city to get provisions. How was the understanding of the Samaritans? The Samaritans previously, prior of this time of requesting provisions, they already had the experience of 2 days with the Messiah. He already had revealed to them what the Messiah would be in the near future. They were already experiencing the second tabernacle services, and then when the Messiah was then completed with those 2 days, he made then a plan to return to Jerusalem and spend the rest of the feast in Jerusalem. Then the Samaritans perceived then his people wanted him to return to the first holy service instead. That's why they did not provide for his people, because they thought the Messiah would then return to the demands of the law. Then people were starting to understand what went on. We find pieces of it in Luke, and then most of the understanding you'll find in Mashiyach, and also in Yohanan, the 4th chapter. So in order for us to understand then the true Gospels, we have to understand tabernacle service. You start describing the Messiah as per tabernacle services, and then the rest of it is incorporated. Then people starting having a clue of the rest of the Torah, always around then tabernacle. How was then the recording started during the first tabernacle service? Was after the tabernacle was set up. Then came the records. The Messiah was taking the place of his father. He had to start with the same principle. His second tabernacle services. Then the Gospels, as the Torah, would have to have the same line of understanding, because it started with the first tabernacle service, continued on after its completion of the spring feast, continuing to the second tabernacle services, and continues on until the closing of the age. So the Gospels, they are then structurized wrongly. They are then structurized by events rather than tabernacles. We have to restructurize the entire Torah, because it has to be around the tabernacle. Then the second tabernacle services, the gospel, must be then structurized per tabernacle. Then what comes in the future as then the galah, or the sound of the shofar, as per tabernacles. Why? Because we are speaking of the 7 cities of Asia Minor, from where the cities are going to sound the shofars. Always tabernacles. So then we find the Messiah, he went up on Mount Gerizim, and there he was transfigured before his people. However, we find on the records, we don't find any Samaritans going up the mountain. You have to understand the context. The Messiah, he had to take the understanding of the first tabernacle service and himself as a completed deal, and show the world outside of Jerusalem what it would be like in the near future. This was absolutely required, because if he had maintained himself in Jerusalem, they would never understand the second tabernacle services, as then related with the Gentile salvation, and not set apart kingship of this earth. So it started making more sense. The Messiah was transfigured on Mount Gerizim, because there then the people were very loyal. They did understand the second tabernacle services, and they received him very promptly, and he was then very loved, and he spent 2 days with them. Then he made preparations to return to Jerusalem and observe the rest of the feast. That's when then his people went on, and they want to get provisions, so he would return to complete the rest of the feast. And then the Samaritans thought he has changed his mind, and they thought the Messiah wanted to maintain the demands of the first tabernacle service. And the Samaritans said, forget it. What the Messiah had explained remained. And they were very loyal, to the point of then not even providing for him to return to observe the rest of the feast. They wanted him to stay with them and continue on with the second tabernacle services. However, there was a section yet not completed as the Messiah being the Redemptor. They did not understand this factor yet. So then we find ourselves understanding what the Messiah went out of his way. He went out of Jerusalem and he was transfigured someplace else, where you find the truth of the Messiah, not even in this place in Mount Gerizim on Jerusalem, but then in every place in the world where his tabernacle was to be found. Thus he proved his point. So we begin then understanding the simplicity and complexity at the same time of the Torah. Don't forget, during this experience on Mount Gerizim, you must include Gilad, the 5th chapter, or Revelation. The opening of the seals was done on the top of the mountain. When the Messiah, he opened the seals, then he was indicating from the second tabernacle services viewpoint what would be coming in the future. At the same time, he was then indicating what's coming next. Then he came down from the Mount Gerizim, and then he gave them 2 days. He explained the situation and gave them 2 days. Then they were grounded in the truth. Then the Messiah had another section to complete in Jerusalem yet, and they were not aware of it for the most part. They wanted the Messiah to be these second tabernacle services, and then from then on throughout the world. But the Messiah had a section of the agenda not yet completed. So while he was then doing his tour, making preparations for the return to Jerusalem, then he wanted his people to get some provisions for the trip. And they say, no, you are not going to return to that junky first tabernacle service, because those demands then are done as you have said. But then the Messiah had to go over there to Jerusalem, and he had to become the Redemptor. So then we begin to piece together the events of the first tabernacle service, the Messiah then completing the spring feast, indicating the outside of Jerusalem's influence via his tabernacle. Then he goes up the mountain, receives then Moshe and Eliyahu, as per instructions indicating the viewpoint of the second tabernacle services, completes then the 5th chapter of Galah, gives them 2 days, and then he returned to Jerusalem to become the Redemptor. Started making more sense. That's why you have then the Gospels, they are not chronological, neither in a set of priorities. It should be first tabernacle, tabernacles, and then the Torah should be structurized via tabernacles. First tabernacle, second tabernacles, and then the rest of it should be below. So we are understanding more and more and more, and more information is coming. Then later we're going to explore more of this section, because we understand the structure of the Torah of the second tabernacle services. It starts with Yohanan, his brother, because he had the experience with the Mashiyach. He was with him on a mountain, and then he received the rest of the understanding regarding the sins of the other cities, then Shimon, and then Yaakov. Why do we have these people then at the first reference? Because they were there on a mountain while he was introducing the second tabernacle services. Because Moshe the law showed up, Eliyahu then the prophet showed up, and he was absolutely on time, and from then on the second tabernacle services had started in the spirit. Worthy was the Lamb. He was received very promptly, very gladly. The entire city was then an uproar of joy because of his presence, while in Jerusalem they were grumpy. They were persecuting him. They were angry at him. Then it started making sense. When he returned to Jerusalem, then he was persecuted and put to death. So from Samaria, then he went to Jerusalem, then he became the Redemptor. Then the second tabernacle services then was about to be then started. But then they have to transition themselves another nearly 100 years so they could understand the complete scope of their services via Shaliach Shaul, Shaliach Shimon, then Shaliach Yaakov, Shaliach Yohanan. And then we received then later the other tabernacles of the 7 cities of Asia Minor, preparing them for the sounding of the shofars. So then the entire Gospels are out of order. They are in chronological order from Gentile mindset and not set apart mindset. Set apart mindset always starts with the tabernacle. The rest of it then is incorporated around its edges. So then later we're going to explore more from this viewpoint, because we have found then the structure of the Torah and the instructions also of the Gospels. Yohanan, Shimon, Yaakov. We have to study Yohanan, and then the first Yohanan, second Yohanan, third Yohanan, then the Galah of Yohanan, then gives us the understanding of the tabernacle. Then understand Shimon. Shimon during the Gospels, Shimon then in Acts, Shimon then first and second. Then comes Yaakov. When we understand these people, we have an understanding of the tabernacle. Then the rest comes later, because Shaliach Shaul was not on a mountain with them. However, he did receive understandings of the second tabernacle services, and then Shaliach Shaul did understand the prophetic shadows of the Torah. So please stay tuned. Much more coming up.